The story we tell ourselves about the great Library of Alexandria is a tragedy of fire. We imagine a single catastrophic blaze, a funeral pyre for the wisdom of the ancient world. But what if that story, the one of a great bonfire of knowledge, is a myth? What if the real story is slower, more complex, and far more unsettling? To find the truth, we must travel back to a city born from the mind of a conqueror, a place designed to be the very center of the world. Our journey begins in the 3rd century BCE, in the gleaming new city of Alexandria in Egypt. After the death of Alexander the Great, his vast empire was carved up by his generals. One of them, Ptolemy I, took Egypt, but he wanted more than just a kingdom. He envisioned a capital that would outshine Athens and Rome, not with armies, but with ideas. He wanted to build the world's intellectual capital. To do this, Ptolemy commissioned a revolutionary project, the Mouseion, or the Institution of the Muses. This wasn't just a building to store scrolls. It was a complete research university, the first of its kind. It had lecture halls, laboratories, observatories, gardens, and living quarters for the greatest minds of the age. Scholars were invited from across the known world, given generous salaries and free lodging, with only one task: to learn, to debate, to discover. At the heart of the Mouseion was its famous library. Its mission was breathtaking in its ambition: to acquire a copy of every single book in the world. Royal agents were sent to buy scrolls from book markets. Every ship that docked in Alexandria's harbor was searched, its books seized and copied by scribes. The original was kept for the library, and the copy was returned to the owner. This relentless acquisition turned Alexandria into the greatest repository of knowledge the world had ever seen. It was a living, breathing archive of human thought, a place where the past and future met. The goal wasn't just to preserve knowledge, but to build upon it, to create a universal record of the human experience. Inside, the shelves held not just scrolls, but entire worlds. Here were the astronomical calculations of Aristarchus of Samos, who argued, 1700 years before Copernicus, that the Earth revolved around the Sun. Here were the medical texts of Herophilus, who discovered that the brain, not the heart, controlled the body. The collection was immense, containing an estimated 500,000 papyrus scrolls. It held the original plays of Sophocles and Euripides, lost histories, forgotten philosophies, and scientific treatises that mapped the stars and the human body. To walk its halls was to walk through the collective memory of civilization. It was, in every sense, the intellectual inheritance of humanity. Then comes our first suspect in the library's destruction, Julius Caesar. In 48 BCE, the Roman general found himself besieged in Alexandria during a civil war. To gain a tactical advantage, he ordered his soldiers to set fire to the enemy's ships in the harbor. The plan worked, but the fire raged out of control. The flames leaped from the ships to the docks, consuming the warehouses and buildings along the waterfront. This is the event most often cited as the destruction of the Great Library, a single decisive act of war that wiped out centuries of accumulated knowledge in one afternoon. But the historical record is more complicated. Ancient writers who describe the fire, like Seneca and Plutarch, confirm that books were burned. However, they are vague on the details. They speak of warehouses full of scrolls being destroyed, possibly those awaiting processing or export. But none of them state explicitly that the main library, the magnificent building within the Mouseion complex, was itself consumed by the flames. The first great suspect may have had an alibi. But flames are not the only way to destroy a center of learning. Sometimes the attack comes from within. A century after Caesar's visit, a new kind of threat emerged, one aimed not at the scrolls, but at the scholars themselves. The ruler Ptolemy VIII, a man known for his cruelty, began a vicious purge of Alexandria's intellectual elite, viewing them as political rivals. He drove out grammarians, philosophers, mathematicians, anyone who might question his authority. This was a different kind of destruction. It was a brain drain that crippled the institution from the inside. A library without scholars is just a warehouse of books. The vibrant community of inquiry that had defined the Museion for generations was shattered, its greatest minds scattered across the Mediterranean. Yet the spirit of learning in Alexandria was resilient. It found a new home. In another part of the city stood a magnificent temple dedicated to the Greco-Egyptian god Serapis. This grand complex, known as the Serapeum, became a new beacon of knowledge. Within its walls, a second major collection of scrolls was housed, a daughter library. This library was likely more accessible to the public than the exclusive Museion, and it grew in importance as the original institution declined. The existence of the Serapeum is a crucial piece of the puzzle. It proves that Alexandria's intellectual treasures were never stored in just one vulnerable location. The story of the library was now the story of two centers, one fading and one rising, both carrying the torch of human knowledge. But the ancient world was a turbulent place, and the city of Alexandria was about to be caught in the crossfire of imperial ambition once again. The next major blow came in the 3rd century, during a period of widespread chaos across the Roman Empire. The formidable Queen Zenobia of Palmyra had conquered Egypt, and the Roman Emperor Aurelian arrived with his legions to win it back. In the year 272, brutal street fighting engulfed Alexandria. The battle was fiercest in the Bruchion, the old royal quarter where the original Museion and Great Library were located. Historical accounts tell us this entire district was razed to the ground. If any part of the original library building had survived until then, this was almost certainly its final, violent end, not as the target of a book burning, but as collateral damage in a war for imperial control. And this brings us to the real, profound truth, the one that is so much more telling than the myth of a single great fire. The greatest library of the ancient world wasn't destroyed in a day. It died a slow death over centuries. Its true killer wasn't a general or a zealot. It was neglect. Think of the library not as a building, but as a living organism. It needed nourishment to survive. In its golden age, that nourishment came from the Ptolemies, who poured vast sums of money into acquiring scrolls, funding research, and supporting scholars. But as Roman rule solidified, Alexandria's status as a royal capital faded. The emperors in Rome had little interest in funding a Greek-speaking intellectual center in Egypt. The patronage dried up. The acquisition of new scrolls halted. The precious papyrus began to decay, and there was no money to copy and preserve it. The institution slowly, quietly starved. The final, fatal blow, the one most often confused for the great fire of myth, came centuries after Caesar. In the year 391 CE, the city of Alexandria was a hotbed of religious tension. The target was not a library, but the Serapeum, a magnificent pagan temple that housed what remained of the city's great collection of scrolls. Urged on by the fiery patriarch Theophilus, a Christian mob, acting under an edict from the Emperor Theodosius to destroy pagan sites, descended upon the temple. They tore it down, stone by stone. Any scrolls housed within its walls were likely lost forever in this act of religious fervor. This was not the burning of the great library, but the destruction of its last echo. A generation later, this new climate of intolerance would claim a human victim who has come to symbolize the end of an era. Her name was Hypatia. A brilliant philosopher, astronomer, and mathematician, she was a beacon of classical learning in a rapidly changing world, admired for her intellect and wisdom. But in 415 CE, her life was brutally cut short. Dragged from her chariot by a mob of Christian zealots, she was murdered in an act of shocking violence. Hypatia's death is often seen as the final tragic punctuation mark on the story of Alexandria's intellectual decline, the moment the light of classical antiquity was violently extinguished. So, If the great library died a slow death by 1,000 cuts, why are we so captivated by the myth of a single catastrophic fire? The answer, perhaps, lies in our love for a good story. A great fire is simple, dramatic, and tragic. It gives us a clear moment to mourn and a clear villain to blame. We can easily picture Julius Caesar's soldiers accidentally setting the docks ablaze, or a fanatical mob putting a torch to centuries of wisdom. These are powerful cinematic images that are easy to grasp. The truth, however, is far messier and more unsettling. The reality is that the library wasn't murdered. It was neglected to death. It faded away due to budget cuts, political purges, and a gradual shift in cultural priorities. This slow, quiet decay doesn't offer a dramatic climax or an easy scapegoat. It suggests a more difficult truth, that a society can simply lose interest in its greatest treasures and allow them to wither into dust. And this is where the real story of Alexandria becomes a powerful and urgent lesson for our own time. Debunking the myth of the Great Fire doesn't diminish the tragedy. Instead, it replaces a simple historical tale with a far more relevant warning about the fragility of knowledge. The greatest threat to our modern repositories of learning, our libraries, archives, and universities, may not come from a single dramatic act of destruction. The danger is the slow, quiet erosion, the defunding of arts and humanities, the dismissal of expertise, and the creeping indifference to the institutions that preserve and create knowledge. The true legacy of Alexandria is a timeless reminder that wisdom is not a monument of stone, but a living garden that withers without constant care. The story we tell ourselves about the Library of Alexandria, a single, magnificent flame devouring the wisdom of the ancient world, is dramatic, simple, and profoundly wrong. The truth is far more unsettling. There was no single moment of destruction. Instead, the greatest repository of knowledge in the ancient world died a slow, quiet death, not from a blaze, but from 1,000 cuts inflicted over centuries. It's a story of dwindling budgets, political purges, ideological shifts, and simple creeping neglect. This slow decay is a chillingly modern tale. We see its echoes today whenever a library has its funding slashed, a university's research program is defunded for political reasons, or an archive is left to languish in a forgotten basement. The greatest threats to knowledge are often not dramatic and obvious, but quiet and insidious. Indifference, it turns out, can be as destructive as any fire. But the myth of a single catastrophic fire is so powerful that history has offered up more than one culprit. Centuries after the library had faded into memory, another story emerged, this one blaming the Arab conquest of Egypt in the 7th century. The legend claims that when asked what to do with the books, the Caliph Omar declared that if they agreed with the Quran, they were redundant, and if they disagreed, they were heretical, and so they were all to be destroyed. This account, however, is almost certainly a fabrication. It appears in sources written more than 500 years after the event, likely created as a piece of political propaganda during the time of the Crusades. By the 7th century, there was likely no great centralized library left to burn. The story of Omar is just another ghost, a convenient scapegoat created to explain a loss that had already happened. So what, then, did we actually lose? Not just scrolls, but entire worlds. We lost the complete histories of the Babylonian priest Berossus, which might have told us the full story of Mesopotamia. We lost most of the 92 plays of the Greek tragedian Euripides. We lost Aristotle's second book of Poetics, which was said to be a brilliant treatise on the nature of comedy. We lost the original star catalogue of Hipparchus, the first great map of the heavens. The loss was more than just the information contained on the papyrus. What vanished was the entire ecosystem of scholarship that the library fostered. It was the hub of the intellectual world, a place where brilliant minds gathered not just to read, but to argue, to collaborate, to critique, and to build upon the works of the past. When the institution crumbled, that unique concentration of human intellect scattered and dissolved. It's a powerful lesson for our own digital age. We believe we have saved everything, storing our collective knowledge in vast, invisible clouds. But this data is fragile. It is vulnerable not to fire, but to format obsolescence, data corruption, and the simple failure to migrate it to new systems. Preserving knowledge isn't just about storage. It's about maintaining the living culture that values, uses, and actively protects it. Ultimately, the end of the Library of Alexandria is not a simple tragedy of destruction. It is a complex cautionary tale about the fragility of civilization. It shows us that knowledge is not a permanent monument of stone, but a garden that requires constant tending. Left to its own devices, it will be overgrown by the weeds of apathy and choked by the vines of ideology. And yet, the light of Alexandria was never completely extinguished. Its knowledge seeped into the intellectual soil of the world. It was carried by scholars to Rome, to Byzantium, and into the burgeoning Islamic Golden Age, where it was translated, preserved, and expanded upon. The ideas nurtured in Alexandria flowed like an underground river, resurfacing centuries later to feed the European Renaissance. The true legacy of the library, then, is not an image of ashes, but a persistent question that echoes through history. It asks us, in our own time, what we are doing to tend to our gardens of knowledge. It forces us to look at our libraries, our schools, and our archives, and wonder if we are the keepers of a flame or simply the managers of a slow and quiet decline.